The
We
fog
need
came in the way
confirmation
it
on those
always did
coordinates
at
before we
Ridgeline
proceed.
Forward Operating Base, not all at
The window
once,
is closing.
but in layers, each one quieter than the last, till the mountains had swallowed every edge and outline, and there was nothing left of the world but the cold
Copy
and the
that.
gray and the
Deploying
distant
assets
sound of
now.
wind moving over rock. It was 0340 hours on a Thursday in late October. The operations room smelled of burnt coffee and the particular anxiety that lives in closed spaces before missions, a compound of gun oil, exhaustion, and something no one ever names but everyone recognizes. Fluorescent light panels buzzed overhead, casting everything in a pale, institutional wash. 3 large monitors along the east wall displayed topographical overlays, thermal imaging feeds, and a blinking grid that no one in the room had fully decoded yet. At the main table, 4 men in uniform leaned over a laminated sector map, arguing in low voices about insertion angles and abort contingencies. None of them looked up when the side door opened and a woman stepped in from the cold. She wore no uniform, dark canvas trousers, a worn wool pullover the color of wet slate, boots that had seen far more terrain than the room she now occupied, no rank insignia, no unit patch, no lanyard, no badge, nothing that said she belonged here or anywhere in particular. She carried a small canvas satchel over one shoulder and a thermos in her left hand, and she moved to the corner of the room nearest the secondary map table without being invited, without being acknowledged, and sat down in a chair that faced the wall of screens. No one told her to sit. No one told her to leave either. She set the thermos on the edge of the table and opened the satchel. From it, she drew a spiral notebook, a mechanical pencil, and what appeared to be a small analog weather instrument, a compact device that measured barometric pressure, humidity, and ambient temperature. She placed it on the corner of the map table and waited for it to calibrate. Staff Sergeant Dale Pryor was the first to notice her, though he said nothing for several minutes. He was 43, a logistical coordinator with a face that had been weathered by 2 decades of forward deployments, and he had the particular quality common to experienced soldiers of noticing everything without appearing to notice anything. He glanced at her once, registered her presence, returned to his work. It was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Holt who finally acknowledged her. Holt was the senior officer present, a man built like a displaced lineman who had found military precision a more useful channel for his particular brand of intensity. He crossed the room toward her with his hands behind his back, which was his way of appearing casual when he was anything but. "Ma'am," he said, and the word carried precisely the weight of a question. She looked up from her notebook. Her eyes were gray-green, the shade of water just before a storm changes the light. She appeared to be somewhere in her mid-40s, though her face was the kind that refused to confirm it. There was a scar at the outer edge of her left eyebrow, thin and old, the kind left not by surgery but by wind-driven debris at high velocity. "Colonel," she said, "this is a restricted operations room." "Yes," she said. "I know." She returned to her notebook. He stood there for another 2 seconds, which is a long time, when you are a lieutenant colonel and you are waiting to be told more, then turned back toward the main table. He said nothing to the other men, but Pryor caught the slight movement at the corner of Holt's jaw, the microtension that in a lesser man might have been confusion, and in Holt was something closer to recognition. She opened her notebook to a page already dense with notation. Wind vectors, elevation deltas, temperature gradient calculations, time-indexed visibility estimates based on barometric rate of change. Her handwriting was precise and small, the kind that had learned economy the same way good marksmen learn breath control, not as discipline, but as natural consequence of what the work requires. Outside, the fog thickened. She wrote for a while. Then she set down her pencil and looked at the topographical screen on the east wall, the one showing the sector grid where the mission was set to unfold. She looked at it for a long time without expression. Then she picked up her pencil again and began adjusting her calculations. The Navy SEALs arrived at 0410. There were 6 of them. They came in from the North Corridor, still carrying the cold on their jackets, and the room changed with them, not loudly, not with ceremony, but in the way a room changes when a particular kind of gravity enters it. These were men for whom the environment was always, first and foremost, a tactical problem to be solved. They assessed the space before they were through the door. Their lead was a chief petty officer named Grant Beckett, call sign Viper 9. He was 37, lean in the way of men who have burned every available calorie on every available deployment, with close-cropped dark hair and the particular stillness of someone whose nervous system has learned to operate at a different baseline than most people's. He moved to the main table. The others distributed themselves around the room, in the unconscious geometry of trained teams. Beckett looked at the sector map. He looked at the screens. He looked at Lieutenant Colonel Holt. "Talk to me," Beckett said. Holt briefed them. The objective was a high-value target operating out of a compound in the Upper Valley. A man who had been tracked to this location for 72 hours and who would not remain trackable for long. The insertion corridor ran through a narrow mountain pass approximately 6 kilometers northeast of the forward operating base. Extraction was to be handled by a two-ship element holding at a staging position 8 kilometers south. Standard, straightforward, except for the terrain. The terrain was the problem. The pass was a known choke point, and the sector's peculiar geography created what the topographers called an inverted wind funnel, a phenomenon where air flowing down from the higher elevations collided with warmer air rising from the valley floor, producing unpredictable gusts at irregular intervals. The thermal imaging on the monitors showed the compound's perimeter. The approach corridor was almost entirely exposure. Beckett listened. His men listened. None of them asked obvious questions. Then one of them, a younger operator, Petty Officer Second Class Tyler Marsh, 26, broad-shouldered and combat-credentialed, but still carrying the particular edge of someone who has not yet learned what he does not know, turned to look at the corner of the room. "Who's that?" Marsh said, not quietly. Holt's pause was fractionally longer than it should have been. "She's here in an advisory capacity." "Advisory," Beckett said. Not a question. He looked at her the way he might look at an object someone had placed on the map table without explanation. She did not look up from her notebook. "Advising on what?" "Exactly," Marsh said. Holt said, "Environmental conditions." Beckett nodded slowly. A kind of professional neutrality settled over his face, the expression of a man who has been in enough rooms with enough people who do not belong there that he has developed a formalized tolerance for it. He turned back to the map. Marsh had not finished. "We've got meteorological data on the screens," he said. "Don't see why we need the screens," she said, without looking up, "are pulling from a regional weather station 40 kilometers south of the insertion point, at an elevation difference of approximately 800 meters. She turned a page in her notebook. "The data you're looking at is accurate for somewhere else." Marsh looked at Beckett. Beckett looked at the woman. She was now writing something at the bottom of a page, her face tilted slightly toward the paper, apparently indifferent to the attention. "What are you calculating?" Beckett asked. "Wind cycle intervals," she said. "The pass generates a rotational airflow pattern. The interval between gusts at your primary approach angle is approximately 7 minutes. The approach window is inside that interval, but only if you're moving by 0527 and out of the exposed corridor before 0541. She set the pencil down and finally looked at him directly. "If you enter the pass at 0540 as currently planned, you'll be in the corridor when the wind pattern reverses. It won't kill you, but it will push thermal signatures on the perimeter sensors and you'll lose the approach advantage before you're in range." Silence. Not the silence of dismissal. The silence of men doing fast arithmetic. "And there's a secondary problem," she said. Beckett waited. "Your exfil angle," she said. "The two-ship is staged at the south position. If the extraction runs long by more than 12 minutes, which it will, given the distance from the objective to your exfil LZ, you'll be pulling out into dawn conditions with a wind shift at your back. Anyone watching the ridge from the northeast will have a clear sightline into your route. That's an acceptable risk in the original brief," Holt said. "Yes," she said, "it is. If the brief is correct about the occupancy count in the compound." She looked at the thermal imaging screen. "It isn't. The room took on a different quality then." Beckett crossed to the east wall. He stood in front of the thermal screen and studied it. After a moment he said, quietly, "Walk me through what you're seeing." She stood at the thermal screen with her notebook open and showed them what she had been doing for the past hour and 15 minutes. The occupancy estimate in the briefing packet put 4 individuals in the compound. The thermal feed, she explained, was being read at face value 4 heat signatures in the main structure, consistent with the stated profile. But the feed had been processed through the standard filter, which applied a baseline correction for ambient temperature. At this elevation, in October, the ambient correction was calibrated for daytime readings, at Trisute, with ground temperature having dropped 14 degrees since the reading was taken. The filter was masking a low-intensity signature in the eastern annex. She pointed to a region of the thermal image that looked, to the untrained eye, like structural interference. "That's not a wall," she said. Beckett looked at it. "That's a body at rest," she said. "Lying down, probably under insulating material. The signature is suppressed because the differential from ambient is narrow. But look at the boundary shape. She traced the outline with the eraser end of her pencil, not touching the screen. Walls don't have that profile. That's a shoulder line. Marsh leaned in. He looked for a long time. He said nothing. So there's a fifth individual, Beckett said. At minimum, she said. The annex has 2 entry points, and the approach in the current plan has neither covered. If that person is a sentry and not a sleeper, your timeline on the primary entry becomes a problem. Beckett turned to Holt. We need to modify the plan. How long will that take? Depends on the modification, Beckett said. He looked at the woman. What are you recommending? She had, apparently, already been thinking about this. She moved to the sector map and indicated a secondary approach line that ran along the western ridge longer, steeper, adding approximately 40 minutes to the infiltration timeline, but allowing for a covered approach to the eastern annex that could be addressed before the primary entry team moved on the main structure. You'd need to split your element, she said. 2 on the annex, 4 on the main structure. Timing has to be coordinated so the annex is secured before the main entry initiates, or the noise signature from the annex will alert the primary objective. That's a tight coordination window in those conditions, one of the other operators said. He had not spoken until now. His name was Petty Officer First Class Darnell Kaufman, and he had the careful, evaluative manner of someone who has learned that the most important skill in his profession is patience. How tight? 90 seconds, she said. Maximum, and the wind cycle is 7 minutes, Kaufman said, thinking out loud. So the coordination window has to open inside the comm phase. Yes, she said. Kaufman nodded slowly. He was doing the same arithmetic Beckett had done and arriving at the same conclusion. Marsh had been quiet for a while. He was looking at the notebook in her hand, the pages of calculations, the wind vectors, the elevation index temperature corrections. He was a young man who was very good at his job, and he had the characteristic of very good young men of occasionally recognizing when he was in the presence of something he did not yet fully understand. What's your background? He said, not with hostility this time, with something closer to genuine curiosity. She closed the notebook. Environmental analysis, she said. It was not quite a lie. It was not quite anything. Beckett had moved back to the map and was redrawing the approach vectors in his head. He traced the western ridge line with one finger, calculating distances, timing windows, elevation changes. Then, he stopped. He looked at the modified approach. He looked at the position she had indicated for the secondary team to establish before the primary entry. He said, this fire position on the western ridge, at this elevation, covering both the annex and the main structure's north face. He paused. That's a 1,400-meter line of sight to the primary entry point. She said nothing. And the annex is at roughly 600, he said. From the same position, she said nothing. He turned and looked at her with a different kind of attention than before. Not the tactical assessment of a senior operator evaluating a briefer. Something older and more careful. Who drew up this approach? He said. I did, she said. When? 2 hours ago, she said. After I read the original plan, he was quiet for a moment. The fire position on the western ridge, he said, is that for the secondary team's cover element, or is it for you? She picked up her thermos, turned it in her hands. The secondary element needs 4 people for the annex, she said. You have 6 operators. That leaves 2 for the western ridge, 1 spotter, 1 shooter. And you're neither, Beckett said. She looked at him steadily. I'm here in an advisory capacity, she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, very quietly, he said, what's your name? She gave him a name. It was a real name, a current name, a name on her travel orders and her access credentials. Her name was Catherine Voss. It did not satisfy him. You could tell, because he stopped asking questions. Men like Beckett stop asking when they've decided to find out another way. It was Kaufman who pulled the thread. He had a tablet. Between the mission planning phases, while Beckett was running revised timing calculations with 2 of the other operators, Kaufman had stepped to the side of the room and was searching quietly, with the methodical patience of someone who has learned that the most useful information is usually 3 or 4 layers below the surface. He found the entry not in active personnel records. Those had been scrubbed, cleanly and professionally, in a way that itself suggested institutional origin, but in an archived after-action report from 11 years prior. A mission in another mountain environment, a different country, a different season. A mission designated in the archive as Operation Silent Ridge. He read it twice. Then he walked to Beckett and held out the tablet. Beckett read it. His face did not change in any dramatic way. It was a slight focusing of attention, the kind of focus that is so complete it looks, from the outside, like absolute calm. The report described a sniper engagement, conducted under extreme conditions. Zero visibility fog, crosswinds gusting to 40 kilometers per hour, target at a range of 3,800 meters across a mountain valley. No spotter, no meteorological support, a single operator, positioned for 11 hours in sub-zero conditions, who waited for a 6-second windbreak that the meteorological models had said was not predicted to occur and who, when it came, made the shot. The engagement had saved 23 lives, an entire reconnaissance element that had been cut off and was being systematically eliminated. The shooter had been listed under a classified designation, but the after-action contained one detail that had survived the redaction. A call sign, Vallejo. Beckett looked across the room at Catherine Voss, who was sitting in her corner again, writing in her notebook, apparently unconcerned with whatever conclusions the men around her might be reaching. He walked to her. He stood in front of her table and waited until she looked up. Silent Ridge, he said. Something passed across her face. Not surprise. Not quite anything that had a name. She looked at him for a moment, then looked back at her notebook. That was a long time ago, she said. The report said the shooter was killed in extraction, Beckett said. Helicopter went down in the Eastern Valley. Yes, she said. And yet, she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. The room continued around them, men planning, screens flickering, the distant whine of wind against the building's north face. He set his elbows on the table and looked at her with the direct, measured attention of a man who has learned that the most useful thing you can do with a difficult truth is look at it straight. Why are you here? He said. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the sector map on the main table at the insertion corridor, the compound, the wind funnel pass, the western ridge. Because the last time I drew a plan like this, she said, someone else executed it. He waited, and I wasn't there to see what I'd missed, she said. It was not a full answer. He understood that. But it was the true part of the answer, and sometimes that is what you get, and it is enough to proceed on. He stood up. He looked at the western ridge position on the map one more time. I need a shooter for that ridge, he said. She looked at him steadily. I know, she said. There had been a before. There is always a before. The difficulty is that it keeps receding, and eventually you stop trying to hold on to it and simply let it become the ground you stand on, invisible, solid, unexamined. Before had included a name that was not Catherine Voss. Before had included a unit designation that no longer officially existed. Before had included a program that operated in the specific gray space between acknowledged and deniable, in the specific terrain between policy and necessity, and which had produced a very small number of very capable people and asked of them a very specific kind of cost. Her name had been Elaine Rutherford. She had been 28 when she first understood that she had a gift. Not the kind of gift that announces itself with ceremony. It had been quiet and practical, like finding out you can navigate by dead reckoning, or that you never get lost in unfamiliar cities. She could read conditions, wind, light, temperature gradient, barometric shift. These were a language she had been born partially fluent in and had spent the subsequent decade and a half learning to speak completely. She had been a meteorological analyst originally. The path to what she became had been indirect and had involved 3 separate evaluations, 2 of which she had not known were evaluations at the time. What she became was Pale Echo. The name had come from the way she worked. No drama, no announcement. You wouldn't know she'd been there until the echo came back, until the result appeared, clean and final, from a distance you had not thought possible. She operated in the silence before the report. The shot itself was almost incidental to the preparation, to the waiting, to the reading of everything that the environment was and was doing and would do in the next 90 seconds. 3,800 meters. In a fog so thick, the valley floor was invisible. She had lain in her position for 11 hours. The ground temperature had been -14. She had not moved anything except her eyes and her fingers and, at the end, her trigger hand. The models had said the wind would not break. She had known the models were wrong because she had been reading the barometric gradient for the previous 3 hours and had seen the pressure differential building along the eastern slope. Not in the data in the air itself, in the way the cold was moving, in the 7-second intervals of almost silence between gusts that were getting fractionally longer. She waited. The window came. She breathed out. She fired. 23 men went home. The helicopter that took her out of the extraction point had gone down in the Eastern Valley due to a mechanical failure that had nothing to do with hostile action. 2 crew members had died. She had survived, and in surviving had found herself in a place the program had not planned for, alive, undocumented, in a country she was not officially in, with a cover identity that had been designed only for the mission and not for the aftermath. She had rebuilt herself slowly, quietly, the way you rebuild anything after a structural failure from the foundation up, in the places no one is watching. She did not talk about what she had lost. She did not talk about the man she had not been able to get back to the spotter from a previous deployment who had been reassigned to the extraction element and had been on a different helicopter. The one that had not come down. He had searched for her. She knew that, later, from people who could not officially tell her, but who found small, deniable ways to let her know. She had not made herself findable. It had seemed, at the time, like the right choice. It seemed, now, like a thing she would carry indefinitely. This mission, this compound, this valley, the man she was trying to close the account on was not the high-value target in the brief. The high-value target was incidental, a genuine national security objective, and she would do what needed doing, but the reason she had spent 18 months quietly maneuvering herself into an advisory role on this particular operation in this particular mountain region was something that had never appeared in any intelligence file. The compound's eastern annex, the fifth thermal signature. She knew who was in that annex. She had known before she arrived at Ridgeline FOB. She had known when she built the approach plan with the fire position on the western ridge. She had drawn the plan so she could be there, so she could finish what 11 years of silence had left unfinished. Beckett modified the plan. He did it efficiently and without ceremony, the way competent people make major adjustments, not by dramatic announcement, but by simply doing it, by incorporating the new information and moving forward. The revised brief went out at 0450. Element composition, timing changes. The secondary approach route, the two positions split. He gave no explanation for the changes to his operators beyond the tactical rationale. They accepted the rationale because it was sound, and because they trusted his judgment, and because they were professionals. He did not tell them about Silent Ridge. He did not tell them about Pale Echo. He told Catherine Voss that she would have the Western Ridge position. He told her that Petty Officer Kaufman would be her spotter, and that Kaufman was very good. She said she did not need a spotter. He said she was getting one anyway. She looked at him for a moment and then accepted this without argument, which he took as a positive sign. Kaufman accepted the assignment with his characteristic unreadable calm. Later, while they were gearing up, he said to her quietly, "I've read about Silent Ridge. Most of it is classified," she said. The unclassified parts were enough, he said. She checked the rifle. She'd been issued a system she knew well, a variant of the platform she had trained on for 2 years before her first deployment. She ran the functions methodically, without hurry, the way she did everything that mattered. Kaufman watched her handle it. He said nothing, but his expression shifted slightly into the category of respectful attention. At 0512, the element moved out into the fog. The cold was immediate and specific. Not the ambient cold of a building inadequately heated, but the real cold of mountain air at 2,300 meters in October, the kind that touches the back of the throat and sits in the joints of the hands and requires a particular interior negotiation to stop noticing. She had done this before. The negotiation was brief and entirely interior. She stopped noticing. The Western Ridge approach was steep and unlit. She and Kaufman moved in silence, separated by 12 meters, using the terrain as the darkness using it back. She knew the ground from the topographical maps she had studied, but maps are abstractions, and ground is ground, and the places where the two diverge are always the places that require the most attention. They reached the ridge position at 0541. The compound was below them and 600 meters to the east for the annex, 1,400 meters to the primary structure. Through the night optics, the fog was a soft gray incandescence broken by the sharper geometries of walls and rooflines. She settled into position. The rifle was braced. She began her environmental assessment. Kaufman, beside her, was reading his own instruments and feeding her data in a low, steady voice. Wind at ridge level, 12 kilometers per hour, bearing 270, gusting intervals at approximately 8 minutes. 7, she said. He checked his timing. He said, 7. You're right. She watched the eastern annex. The thermal scope showed the fifth signature clearly from this angle, unmistakably human, sitting now, not lying. Movement in the past 20 minutes. Beginning to be alert, she regulated her breathing and did not think about who it was. She thought about the conditions. She thought about the 7-minute window, the temperature differential between the ridge and the valley floor, the way the air was moving across the open ground in front of the compound's north face. She thought about the shot she was not yet taking. She was waiting for the confirmation that would tell her what she already knew. At 0554, the primary element initiated. Beckett's 4 operators moved through the pass on the revised timing, with 12 minutes of clean conditions. The wind in its quiet phase, the thermal signature of the compound's main structure clearly resolved in their optics. They were very good. They moved with the focused economy of men who have done this enough times that the fear has been metabolized into something that serves the work rather than interfering with it. The secondary element, 2 operators designated for the eastern annex, was holding at the base of a dry creek bed 40 meters west of the annex wall, waiting for her signal. She was watching the annex. The 5th signature had moved again. It was near the door now. Secondary element, she said into the communications channel, low and steady. Hold. Target is mobile. Stand by. Marsh's voice came back. Copy. Standing by. It was Marsh on the secondary element. She had not requested this, and if she had been asked, she might have preferred someone else, not because she doubted his competence, but because she understood, in the way you understand things about people after an hour in a room with them, that he was still sorting out what he thought about her, and that this was not the ideal condition for the kind of precision the next 3 minutes required. But she had not been asked, and there was nothing to do about it now. The door of the eastern annex opened. A man stepped out. He stood in the cold for a moment, looking toward the north, not at her position, but at the mountain ridgeline in general, the way you look at something that gives you an uneasy feeling without a specific cause. He was wearing a field jacket over civilian clothing. He was carrying a short-barreled weapon in his right hand, loosely, not raised. He was not the man in any intelligence photograph she had been shown. He was a man named Owen. She had known him for 2 years, 11 years ago. He had been her spotter, the one who had not been on the helicopter that went down, the one who had been told she was dead, the one who had, apparently, spent the intervening decade on a path she could reconstruct now only and outline the loss of someone you believed in completely, the gradual substitution of certainty for something else, the kind of choices that begin as pragmatic and end as something with no clean name. He had been turned. Not by ideology, she did not believe that of him, even now. By grief and by the long, grinding calculus of a man who had believed in something that was then taken from him without explanation. She knew all of this. She had known it for 3 months. She had built this mission around the knowledge. She had not told Beckett. She looked at him through the scope at 600 meters. The fog was between them like something that wanted to forgive them both. Her breathing was even. Her hands were still. Target is stationary, she said into the comms. Stand by. Kaufman, beside her, said nothing. He was watching through his own optic. He was very still. At 0558, the primary element made contact with the main structure. It was controlled and brief. Beckett's operators moved with the kind of precision that justifies everything that goes into making them, the years, the cost, the specific shape of sacrifice that professional violence demands from the people who practice it well. The primary objective was secured in 4 minutes and 12 seconds. 2 individuals in the main structure, both taken alive. The perimeter sensors did not trigger. The thermal suppression had held, but the sound carried. Not much. A door impact, a shout cut short. The percussion of a flash device in an enclosed space, sounds that traveled across 200 meters of cold mountain air and arrived at the eastern annex, attenuated but unmistakable. Owen turned toward the sound. His weapon came up. Secondary element, she said. Move now. Marsh and his partner came over the annex wall in the same breath. Owen heard them and turned back. 3 things happened in the next 4 seconds in a sequence, so compressed it was essentially simultaneous. Owen raised his weapon toward Marsh. Marsh was not yet clear of the wall, and Catherine Voss breathed out to the bottom of her lungs and held it there. The distance was 612 meters. The wind was in its quiet phase, but not calm. There was a 3 km/h surface drift from the northwest, and the temperature differential between her position and the valley floor created a slight vertical refraction. She had been calculating for it since she settled into position 43 minutes ago. She fired. The report from the suppressed rifle was a sharp flat crack that disappeared immediately into the fog and the cold and the mountain. Owen went down. Marsh cleared the wall, assessed, keyed his radio. Target is down. Annex clear. She did not move for a moment. She stayed in position, her eyes still at the scope, looking at the space where a man she had known had been standing. The fog moved across it gently. The compound's lights, triggered by the primary breach, threw a cold white wash across the courtyard. Kaufman said nothing. She lowered the rifle. She breathed. Outside, somewhere beneath the fog, the mission concluded. Beckett's voice on the primary channel. Situation secured. Initiating exfil. All elements move to extraction. Clean. Professional. The language of men who have done what they came to do and are now focused on going home. She sat in the cold on the western ridge and did not move for a little while. There is a kind of silence that follows the completion of something that has been postponed for a very long time. It is not relief. It is something more complicated and less comfortable than relief. It is the feeling of a question that has been answered, and of learning that the answer does not resolve anything as cleanly as you had believed it would. She had come here for Owen. She had not been able to admit, even to herself until this moment, that she had also come here for herself, for the accounting, for the debt she had decided she owed not to the mission, not to the program, not to any institutional abstraction, but to the specific fact of 23 men who had gone home because of a shot she had taken, and to one man who had lived the following 11 years without the truth. You cannot give someone back 11 years. You can only close the distance. Kaufman said, quietly, "We need to move." "Yes," she said. She stood up. She secured the rifle. She looked once more at the valley below, at the compound with its lights and its movement, at the fog that was beginning, very slowly, to lift as dawn touched the eastern ridge. Then she followed Kaufman back down the western slope, moving carefully and without hurry, while behind them the mountain held everything that had happened in its gray and indifferent keeping. The primary element was at the extraction LZ by 0632. She and Kaufman arrived at 0641, 8 minutes inside the extraction window. The two-ship element held on the south staging position, and the sound of rotors at distance was the sound of mission conclusion, the specific and reliable sound of logistics fulfilling their purpose, which is the most honest form of institutional promise-keeping there is. Beckett was at the LZ when she came in from the western approach. He was managing the handoff of the secured primary objective, dealing with the immediate aftermath in the quiet and methodical way he dealt with everything. He glanced up when she arrived, assessed her, looked at Kaufman. Kaufman gave a single small nod. The kind of nod that communicates the specific information. It went the way she said it would, and everything is accounted for. Beckett returned the nod. He looked back at the secured objective. Marsh was at the edge of the LZ, his gear consolidated, his breathing still elevated from the annex approach. He looked at her when she came in, looked at her the way you look at someone after something has happened that changes the category they occupy in your understanding. Not warmly, exactly. Not with the specific warmth of a man who has been proven wrong about someone and is delighted by it. With something more serious than that, with a recognition that had weight. He said, "Thank you." It was not a decorated sentence. He was not, in that moment, a man of many words. He was a young operator at the end of a mission that had gone correctly because of adjustments made by a person he had initially dismissed, and he was doing the only honest thing available to him, acknowledging it directly. She looked at him for a moment. "You moved well over that wall," she said. It was not warmth, exactly, either. It was the specific acknowledgement of a professional who had seen another professional do their work under pressure and seen it done well. He received it that way. One of the helicopters settled into the LZ. The rotor wash hit and the temperature dropped another 3 degrees, and the last of the fog that had clung to the valley floor went sideways and disappeared, and for the first time in hours, the mountains around them were visible gray and white and enormous in the early light, indifferent and beautiful in the specific way that high terrain is always indifferent and always beautiful. The operators began loading. Beckett paused before boarding. He stood at the edge of the LZ and looked at her, and there was in his face the specific expression of a man who has arrived at something he will not fully articulate but will carry for a long time. He said, "Are you coming back with us?" She looked at the helicopters. She looked at the mountain. "No," she said. He accepted this, the way he accepted most things without unnecessary pressure, with the kind of respect that consists of taking someone's answer as their answer. "There are things in the debrief that are going to require explanation," he said, "about the annex, about the target." "I know," she said. "Send Kaufman." Kaufman, who had been listening, looked at her. She looked at him. He understood. "I'll handle it," Kaufman said. Beckett was quiet for a moment. He looked at her one more time, this small, composed woman in civilian clothing on a mountain LZ, with the early light beginning to come over the eastern ridge, and the fog clearing and everything that had been hidden becoming gradually, provisionally visible. He said, "For what it's worth." She waited. "It was worth it," he said. "Coming back. Whatever the reason, she looked at him steadily. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that she did not yet know if that was true. She did not say what she knew, which was that it would take a long time to know. She said, "Get your people home." He turned and boarded the helicopter. The rotors built to departure pitch, and the two-ship lifted, banked south, and diminished into the gray-blue sky until they were sound without shape and then nothing at all. She was alone on the LZ. Around her, the debris of occupation, boot prints in the frost, a scuff mark where a pack had dragged, the chemical smell of fuel fading into cold air. The mountain recovered these things efficiently. By afternoon, if anyone looked, they would see only ground. She stood there for a while. The fog was gone now, pulled apart by the rising temperature and the morning wind, and the valley below was exposed in its full morning dimension, deep and wide and complicated, with the compound a small geometry of walls at the valley floor and the mountain ridges on either side receding into distance and light. Beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when they have been the site of something true and terrible and necessary. The kind of beauty that does not comfort. She thought about Owen. She thought about what it takes for a person to become something they were not. The sequence of events, small, large, invisible, enormous, that construct the gap between who someone was and who they became. She had spent 11 years becoming Catherine Voss, which was a kind of gap of its own. She did not give herself grace that she was not prepared to extend to him. She extended it to him and found it did not make the account cleaner. Some accounts do not become clean. They become closed. There is a difference. She thought about the shot at 3,800 meters, 11 years ago, and the 23 men, and the way she had not thought about any of them specifically in the aftermath, because if you begin to think about specific people and specific stakes in the moment of execution, the thing becomes impossible and it must remain possible. You think about the conditions. You think about the mathematics. You let the responsibility be held somewhere else while your hands are doing what your hands need to do. Then, later, you carry it. That is the arrangement. She had been carrying it for 11 years. She would carry this now too. The weight would be different, not heavier, exactly, but differently distributed. Something had shifted in the architecture of what she owed and what she had paid. She put on her pack. She pulled out the map. She carried paper, not digital, because paper does not need a signal or a battery, and does not know who is looking at it, and oriented herself to the Eastern Valley route. There was a town 40 kilometers south, with a transit connection and a cover identity waiting in a locker at a station she had visited 3 times in the past 6 months to ensure the route was clean. She had a life. It was quiet and specific and built of things that were hers, truly hers, in the way that things become truly yours when you have constructed them with your own hands from nothing, with no institutional support and no one else's definition to shelter under. It was not the life she had had before. It was something else, something that required a different kind of courage, not the courage of conditions and mathematics, but the ordinary, grinding courage of continuing, of remaining available for the next thing, of not going so deep into yourself that you lose the surface entirely. She had not lost it. She was not sure if she deserved that. She had decided to proceed as if it did not matter whether she deserved it. She started down the eastern approach. The mountain received her without ceremony, as it had received everything that had happened this morning, as it would receive the morning itself as the hours moved forward quietly, without preference, without record, the way high ground holds all the things that happen in its vicinity. The violence and the endurance and the terrible precision and the grief and the long silences between people who have done something together that cannot be undone, and who must now return to whatever their lives are outside of this mountain, on this morning, in this light. Far below, in the valley, the compound was already being processed, personnel teams moving through it, documentation and extraction, and the administrative aftermath that follows every mission, the institutionalization of what had been, until 20 minutes ago, only plans and risks and living people making consequential choices. She did not look back. The eastern ridge caught the first full light of morning and went briefly gold, a specific, clear gold, the kind that lasts only a few minutes before the ordinary blue of day takes over, and which the mountains produce so routinely that only people who pay attention to conditions notice it, and only those people understand how reliable it is, how it comes back every morning, regardless of what happened the night before. She noticed it. She kept walking. 4 days later, Colonel Marcus Holt sat down to write his after-action summary. He had been doing this for 21 years. He knew the form, the language, the careful architecture of institutional documentation that acknowledges what happened while controlling what is understood about what happened. He was good at it. It was a skill, like any other, that required both precision and a particular kind of selective vision. He stared at the blank entry field for the advisory role designation. He had the name on her travel orders, Catherine Voss. He had the access credential numbers. He had the contact routing code that went to a department that returned, when queried, only the confirmation that the individual was operating with appropriate authorization. He did not have a unit. He did not have a chain of command. He did not have, in any of the official channels he had quietly checked in the past 4 days, any record that fully accounted for what had happened on that western ridge at approximately 0558 hours. What he had was Kaufman's debrief, which was accurate, professional, and almost entirely devoid of the specific texture of experience that makes a debrief feel like it is telling you what actually occurred, rather than what can be officially confirmed to have occurred. He had asked Kaufman directly. Once, after the formal debrief concluded, Kaufman had looked at the middle distance for a moment, in the way of someone organizing something complex, and had said, "She was better than anyone I've ever seen at that distance, and she knew something about the target that wasn't in the brief." Holt had waited. "She didn't explain it," Kaufman said, "and I decided not to ask." That was Kaufman's answer. Holt respected it. He had asked Beckett. Beckett had been quiet for a longer time. He was a man who took his time with things that deserved it. He had said, "Finally, she came back for something. She got it. Whatever it wasn't what she told us. But everything she told us was true, and everything she did was right. That's all I've got." Holt had said, "That's not enough for the after-action." Beckett had said, "No, it isn't," and that had been the end of the conversation. Holt looked at the blank field. He thought about the thermal screen at 0400 hours and a woman in civilian clothing pointing to the shape of a shoulder inside a signature that his entire operations team had read as structural interference. He thought about the revised timing, the modified approach, the fire position on the western ridge that had been drawn, apparently, for reasons that had nothing to do with the mission brief and everything to do with the specific accounting of a specific life. He typed, slowly and carefully, the description that was true in the most reduced sense. Civilian subject matter expert, environmental analysis, provided critical pre-mission assessment, resulting in plan modification and materially improved mission outcome. Travel orders on file. Further classification at source agency discretion. He saved the document. He sat with it for a moment. Then he opened a separate window not part of the official report system, just a personal document he kept for the things that the official reports did not hold room for, and he wrote one line, the shot from the western ridge. 612 meters. Fog. Pre-dawn. Suppressed. Single round. Ask somebody who knows what that means. He closed the document. He went back to work. The mission was finished. The account was in the system. The mountain had given nothing back except the evidence that could be seen, which was the evidence that pointed only to the men whose names were already in the record. Somewhere, 40 kilometers south and already in transit toward a connection that led somewhere else and then somewhere else again, a woman in civilian clothing was on a bus with her pack between her feet and her notebook open on her knee, and she was writing the kind of calculations that have nothing to do with wind or temperature or barometric pressure. The kind that require a different instrument entirely and a different kind of patience. She was not at peace. She had not expected to be. She was, for the first time in 11 years, unfinished with something in a direction she recognized, not the unfinished quality of a debt, but the unfinished quality of a life that has more left in it. The distinction mattered. She was working out what to do with it. The bus moved south through the mountain valley. The morning light was ordinary and clear and full of the plain, unremarkable fact of another day beginning, which is the most reliable thing the world offers, and which she had long since learned to receive without sentiment and without ingratitude. She wrote in her notebook, outside the window, the mountains receded. Some people do not disappear. They wait. And when the world requires what only they can give, they come back to the specific cold of high ground and the specific silence before a shot and the specific weight of something that has been owed for a very long time. They do what needs doing. And then they walk back down the mountain alone, into the morning, carrying what they carry. That is not tragedy. That is what it looks like when someone refuses to be finished.